Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take some of your questions, and we're going to start this week with Martin over on the Patreon who asks, at most of the appearances this week, it seems that more than one member of the press kept asking the Prime Minister when he's going to invoke the Emergencies Act and why he hasn't invoked it yet. I can't help but wondering if there's an element out there who is or are just waiting for the PM to do that so they can excoriate him for doing what his father did. Do you think this plays into the PM's thinking to any extent at all? I think there's a couple of aspects to this. I think one of them is that an Emergencies Act declaration is a fairly easy narrative for people to understand. And so I think that's partially where that thinking is. Right now, with every province and territory invoking their own legislation and their own Emergencies Acts, has created kind of a bit of a patchwork in terms of what is and isn't allowed around the country. And I think there's this thinking that if we just have one federal declaration, it'll make it easier for everyone, it's easier to understand. I don't know that that's necessarily the case or even prudent. There is certainly a great deal of value in having states of emergency that are more localized so that there can be more localized responses and that responds to more local epidemiology. But I think the underlying aspect here is ease. It's just easier to understand. Part of the problem, though, as well, is they don't necessarily comprehend what the act is actually intended to do. It's not simply a declaration of martial law, because we don't really have those mechanisms in Canada the Emergencies Act has four specific kinds of levels, and public health emergency is the lowest level. So it's not like we'd be calling in the army, even though provinces can ask the army to come in regardless. And the army has really no appetite for doing policing. So I think there's a lot of simplistic narratives that people are trying to hold on to, and that's really what we're seeing more than anything else. There might be one or two people out there who thinks, it's another, practically a pre-written story where Trudeau invokes the same kind of measures that his father did, but a pandemic is not the FLQ crisis. It's not terrorists kidnapping foreign diplomats. It's a very different thing altogether. So I have a hard time believing it's just simply for the sake of trying to say Trudeau père and fils. More, I think that it's an attempt to try and simplify things, and I don't think that that's necessarily actually how it does or should work. Our next question comes from someone who calls themselves Scrappy McBuckyball on the Twitter machine, and asks, can you explain the unprecedented power grab objectively? It seems like an overreach at worst, but I'd like to hear your take. So this is the provisions that were in the emergency legislation that were debated this past week. And some of those involved giving the finance minister the power or basically the power over taxation without needing to go to Parliament to approve it. And that is pretty unprecedented in how our system operates. Parliament has been basically accumulating these powers and privileges, particularly over taxation, steadily since the Magna Carta. And these kinds of powers haven't been enacted by an executive since, the 1680s. And there is at least one king who's been decapitated for trying to do an end run around Parliament in this kind of a way. So it is significant. Unprecedented power grab, yes, to an extent, but part of this is also just hyperbole, as is not completely unexpected. But it was a significant ask. It was almost certainly unconstitutional to try and grant themselves these kinds of powers. So that's kind of why it's significant. It does sound like they were willing to back down on that quite quickly, which is good. There were other things that they were negotiating around that. So that was partially why it took 13 hours or so in order to get that accomplished. But it is something, we should be aware of. I mean, Parliament has these powers for a reason. And it doesn't really matter that, yes, there is a pandemic situation, but we shouldn't dismiss Parliament entirely, even though that's going on. Parliament matters, and this is something I keep saying, and this is a perfect example of why Parliament matters. I mean, Parliament has these powers over the public purse for a reason. It's so that, the king or the queen, by way of the prime minister, can't act unilaterally in these kinds of matters because, the public purse is a fairly sacrosanct thing in our conception of democracy. So that's one of the reasons why it was significant. There are other things in there, such as the borrowing powers, which is a bugaboo of mine, because that was something the Conservatives gave themselves tucked away in an omnibus budget bill a few years ago. And there have been efforts, mostly on the Senate side, to try and restore that power back to Parliament ever since. The Liberals, when they came in, promised they were gonna undo that. They were gonna restore the power of public borrowing to Parliament, and then they kind of weaseled out of that and instead gave themselves a kind of debt ceiling that they'd have to go to Parliament to exceed that, and there was little chance that they were going to get there. So nobody thought twice about it. That may change now that we are doing unprecedented amounts of borrowing because of the economic crisis that this pandemic has unleashed. So I think that was one of the ways that they tucked that in this bill as well, so they can get around having to do another vote on public debt. So again, it's important. It's one of these fairly sacrosanct things of why our parliamentary system works the way it does. But that particular case, the public borrowing one, is one where unfortunately that battle kind of was lost before it even started. So it's one of these things I call attention to when I possibly can, like I am right now, but that's kind of where we are. Our last question is from Patricia, who says, a lot of people are watching these Q&A sessions with the media and are curious to know who decides what journalists get to ask a question, who runs them, and normally it's the Parliamentary Press Gallery, right? And under normal circumstances, yes, because normally when press conferences are run, it's in a space controlled by the Press Gallery, so we have our own moderator who will decide who gets to ask questions. And they tend to do it in a way that's sort of first come, first serve, but the moderator will try and alternate English and French wherever possible in order for a sense of fairness to take place. And normally in these kinds of events, there's translation provided as well. It's been a little different the last few weeks because we're not operating in spaces where the Press Gallery actually controls. So these are both outside of Rideau Cottage when the Prime Minister has his pressers, and they've used a large committee room in the West Block to hold them now, so that we can ensure proper physical distancing, and everyone's not kind of crammed all together like they normally would be in the National Press Theatre. So My understanding of how that's changed is it's ministerial staffers who are largely running things now. The gallery is offering support and so on, but they've largely been playing by gallery rules. It's also slightly different too, because we're doing a lot more by questions by teleconference now, whereas that is a very rare occurrence otherwise. Normally it'll be for specific issues that would be of interest to people who are less concentrated in the press gallery like normally. So it's also the moderators on those calls who are deciding who gets to answer those questions, and those are the teleconference moderators rather. But they do seem to be taking a fair amount of care to ensure that we've still got this kind of one English, one French kind of situation going on, in order to ensure that things are running as smoothly and normally as possible. So that's kind of the situation we're in right now. Once we can get back to normal, assuming that's possible, I'm sure we'll go back to press gallery running conferences like they normally would be. I don't see any particular appetite in doing this kind of a setup over a long term, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So hopefully that helps. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thank you.